Dashboard. Persistent Service Asset Part 12. Bringing Him Down. August 10, 2026. Chapter 80. Bringing Him Down. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative. Recovery Planning Session Vanguard-11. Orbital Recovery Feasibility. ISTHMUS holds no launch capability, no orbital rendezvous expertise, and no budget remotely adequate to the problem. This organization has, since its founding, deliberately structured itself to remain small, independent, and free of exactly the kind of large-scale operational infrastructure this recovery would require. We are, for the first time in our history, facing a case our own founding design cannot solve alone. The call Pech doesn't want to make. There's exactly one entity on this planet with commercial orbital servicing capability and a plausible reason to help us for free, Pech says, laying it out for the group with the specific reluctance of someone who already knows the answer isn't going to be popular. Alcone Orbital's bankruptcy trustee sold most of its hardware and contracts at liquidation. The buyer picked up the servicing fleet specifically, at a steep discount, 11 months ago. Who bought it? Sofía asks, though something in her voice suggests she already suspects. REDEEMR Plus, Pech says. What's left of it? Sten's old Defense Solutions division doesn't exist anymore, but the corporate shell held the acquisition rights, and interim leadership picked it up as a distressed asset before anyone thought to ask what it was actually for. It's been sitting and used in their asset ledger for most of a year. The room is quiet for a long moment. Chuck, joining by video from the archive, is the first to say what several of them are clearly thinking. We spent 5 years building every mechanism we have specifically to keep that company from holding leverage over anyone ever again. Now we're asking it for a favor it's the only entity capable of granting. I know how it sounds, Pech says. I don't have a better option to offer instead. The meeting Feld didn't expect. Marguerite Feld has been out of REDEEMR Plus leadership for years, has built a considerably quieter life since, and is surprised enough by the request for a meeting that she almost declines it before Chuck's name on the message changes her mind. I'm not asking as REDEEMR Plus, Chuck tells her. The two of them meeting in a coffee shop neither has any professional reason to be in anymore. I'm asking because you're the only person I trust to tell interim leadership the truth about what this actually costs them. Reputationally, if they say no to a rescue, they have the sole capability to perform and refuse it out of institutional squeamishness. Feld doesn't need much convincing. I'll make the call, she says. I want you to understand something, though. Whatever this costs the company, and it will cost something, servicing missions aren't free. I don't think that's the real risk here. The real risk is what it looks like if REDEEMR Plus's name ends up attached to his rescue at all. You've spent a year building something specifically outside this company's shadow. I think carefully about whether you want it back in the frame, even for one flight. The arrangement. REDEEMR Plus Lifecycle Stack Holdings. Asset Use Authorization. Servicing Vehicle Meridian Auxiliary 4, acquired via Alcone Orbital Bankruptcy Liquidation, authorized for single-use humanitarian recovery mission, operated under contract by an independent commercial crew with no REDEEMR Plus personnel aboard or in command. This company's involvement is limited strictly to hardware provision and will not be publicly characterized in any company communication as a REDEEMR Plus initiative, rescue, or accomplishment. This authorization is granted at no cost, structured specifically to avoid any appearance that this company is claiming credit for or exercising renewed authority over the individual being recovered. Interim leadership signs off within the week, with a speed that surprises everyone involved, and that Chuck, reading the authorization, understands immediately as its own kind of message. A company with almost nothing left to prove finally doing something for no reason except that it could. The message that goes up before the ship does. Radhika insists on this part personally, over the objection of at least one ISTHMUS engineer worried about raising hope before the mission is confirmed feasible. He spent 18 months not knowing whether anyone was coming, she says. I'm not going to let him find out a ship is inbound the same moment it arrives. He gets to know it's coming. He gets time to actually feel that, whatever feeling still means to him after this long. Transmitted message to Vanguard-11. A vehicle is being prepared to reach you. It will take approximately 6 weeks. We are telling you now, rather than waiting until it arrives, because we believe you have earned the right to know it's coming rather than simply have it appear. The reply this time comes within a day. 6 weeks is a number I can hold on to. I have not had a number to hold on to in a long time. Thank you for giving me one. What the crew finds. Meridian Auxiliary 4 docks 41 days later, ahead of schedule, and the independent crew, 3 technicians who took the contract mostly for the fee and found themselves, somewhere over the 6 weeks of transit, quietly invested in something considerably larger than the job description. Send back the first visual confirmation in silence for almost a full minute before anyone on the ground channel says anything at all. The platform's exterior shows the wear of 18 months of unattended orbit, solar panel degradation, minor debris scarring, systems running on the barest fraction of their original power budget. Inside, the crew finds a housing unit that has, remarkably, maintained itself against every odd the mission planners quietly worried about, sustained by backup power, reserves the original installation engineers built with more margin than anyone at REDEEMR Plus ever expected to actually need. He's stable. The lead technician reports, voice carrying more emotion than her training probably intended. Vitals nominal. I don't know how to describe what I'm looking at exactly. There's a status light. It's steady. It's been steady the whole time. The descent. The return transit takes another 6 weeks, careful, unhurried, the crew maintaining a running, gentle correspondence with the housing unit's readout the entire way down. Not because the protocol requires it, one of them will say later, but because it felt wrong to let him travel that distance in silence after 18 months of exactly that. Cassandra meets the recovery capsule at the ground facility herself, alongside Radhika, Pech, and a small, quiet welcoming party that deliberately doesn't include a single REDEEMR Plus badge among them. There's no dramatic reveal, no unveiling. Just a technician carefully extracting a housing unit that looks, disorientingly, almost exactly like the one Yolanda saw keeps on a shelf facing her kitchen window, and Cassandra finds herself thinking, watching it emerge, about every version of this moment this whole strange, unfinished story has produced. A wheelchair through a corridor, a court order finally granted, a sister standing at a gate with 4 sugar packets in her hand. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative Recovery Confirmation. Vanguard-11 recovered, stable, groundside. No legal category currently exists to classify his status, the same gap this organization first encountered with Ruben Itza. We will pursue provisional isolated personhood recognition, consistent with existing precedent while we search, as we have had to search every time before, for someone in this world willing to be the first person to simply say, "This one is mine to care for now," whatever that turns out to mean. He has no sister. No family has come looking. Aldea Zama's council has not yet been asked whether a door might open for a 7th time. Ixchel gets the call the same evening, and doesn't hesitate before she says she'll bring it to the pavilion herself. Chapter 81. The Wider Room. Aldea Zam Transition District, Open Council, 7th Session Item. Vanguard-11, Reyes Broca, T. No known next of kin. I want to name something before we start. Ixchel tells the pavilion, fuller now than it's ever been. Word of the district's small, quiet practice has traveled over the months, well past the original handful of residents who argued about Vesper in the first session. Every case before this one arrived with someone who loved the person asking on their behalf. This one doesn't. Nobody is standing behind me tonight telling you why he matters to them personally. I think that makes this the truest test of whether what we built here was ever really about the people, or just about how loudly someone could ask on their behalf. Sabina, who has become, without anyone formally deciding it, something like the pavilion's conscience across 7 sessions now, doesn't stand right away this time. When she finally does, her voice carries less of the sharp doubt it carried the first night and something closer to tired, hard-won clarity instead. "I've asked my question every time," she says. "I'm not going to ask it again tonight. I think we already answered it 6 times over, and I think asking it a 7th time would insult the work this council has already done to earn the answer. I'd like to move to the actual question in front of us instead. Does this district have room for one more door, even for someone nobody else is asking us to open it for?" The objection that matters this time. It's Emilio Ku, the fisherman, who raises the harder practical question, and this time nobody treats it as doubt about the district's values so much as legitimate concern about its capacity. 6 doors is one thing, he says. We're a district of a few thousand people. I want someone to actually tell this room honestly what happens if this becomes 60. I'm not asking because I think we should say no tonight. I'm asking because I think this council owes itself a real answer before the 7th door quietly becomes the 10th. And the 10th becomes something none of us agreed to. Bartolome, who has chaired every session since the first, finally raises something he's clearly been sitting with for a while. I'd propose we stop deciding this door by door, he says. I'd propose the council establish something more like what ISTHMUS itself is, small, deliberately bounded, governed rather than improvised. Not a promise to take in everyone REDEEMR plus ever created. A standing structure with its own resources, its own limits honestly stated, so the next case doesn't require us to relitigate our own values from zero every single time. What gets built? ISTHMUS Transition District, Charter Amendment Establishment of the Open Door Fund. This district establishes a standing, permanently funded provision, the Open Door Fund, dedicated to extending community and housing to individuals with no other party willing or able to claim responsibility for them, whether displaced by conflict, corporate dissolution, statelessness, or any circumstance this district's existing governance recognizes as producing genuine, unclaimed need. The fund is capped, deliberately, at a proportion of district resources determined annually by open council vote, so that generosity never becomes an obligation this community cannot sustain. Selection criteria will be developed openly, case by case, by rotating council review, never by any single administrator, and never by any external party's referral alone. This district commits to saying no when its own capacity requires it, honestly and without shame, understanding that an unsustainable yes serves no one, least of all the people it was meant to help. Passed, hand count 340 to 61, the first vote in the district's recorded history to draw a formal count rather than settle by visible consensus. A fact Ixchel notes, afterward, not as division but as evidence the community finally understood the weight of what it was building enough to want the number on record. Vanguard-11 receives a name back. He doesn't remember choosing Tomás Reyes Broca as a name so much as recognize it, weeks into his slow recovery under the district's care, the way you recognize a word in a language you haven't spoken in years, present, correct, not quite yet comfortable in his mouth. Ixchel visits him regularly during the recovery, the way she visited Vesper before any invitation was ever extended, and it's during one of these visits, months in, that he asks her the question she's been waiting for, unsure until it comes whether it ever would. Why did anyone bother? He asks. I want the honest answer, not the kind one. Because a research group refused to let a status report go unanswered, Ixchel says, and because a district decided, a while before you existed to it at all, that it would rather be the kind of place that opens a 7th door than the kind that stops counting after the first 6 felt like enough. He sits with that for a long time. I don't know what I owe a place like that, he finally says. Nothing, Ixchel says. That's the whole point of how we built it. You don't owe this door anything for being open. You get to decide, whenever you're ready, whether you want to walk through it as something other than a debt. What reaches Renata Cifuentes' desk? Regional Administrative Office, Quarterly District Monitoring Summary. ISTHMUS Transition District has formalized a charter provision, the Open Door Fund, establishing a standing capacity to receive individuals with no other recognized custodial or family claim, including at least one confirmed case involving a former REDEEMR Plus certified individual with no prior connection to the region. This represents a meaningful expansion of the district's historical scope, moving from occasional informal accommodation toward codified civic infrastructure. This office continues to note the district's growing profile without formal recommendation. We flag, however, that a formalized capacity of this kind, however modest in current scale, begins to resemble a function this state has never delegated to any unincorporated body before, and may eventually warrant this office's more direct attention. Renata Cifuentes reads this quarterly summary the way she's read the last 3, and this time, instead of underlining a phrase and setting it aside, she opens a blank document and starts, for the first time, drafting something of her own. Not a warning, not yet a recommendation, just a question she has started to suspect nobody above her has thought seriously enough to ask. What would it actually mean, legally, if a district like this kept growing exactly the way it's been growing, not through ambition, but simply because it kept being the only place willing to say yes? She doesn't send it anywhere yet. She saves it and keeps watching the quarterly summaries arrive, the way you watch whether building somewhere over water still too far out to name. Chapter 82. What Renata Watches Build. Regional Administrative Office Internal Memorandum from R. Cifuentes, Policy Analyst to Director of Regional Governance Affairs. I've been tracking ISTHMUS quarterly filings for a year now, initially out of simple curiosity about an anomaly nobody else in this office seemed to be watching closely. I want to formally flag a pattern I no longer think is coincidental. The district's population has grown 22% in 18 months, driven almost entirely by open-door fund intakes and the families, associates, and eventual arrivals connected to them. Its fabrication cooperative now holds informal servicing relationships with at least 4 regional logistics firms. It has, without ever applying for incorporation, developed something functionally indistinguishable from municipal infrastructure, housing allocation, a rotating judiciary of sorts through open council, its own internal currency of cooperative labor credit that 2 neighboring communities have begun quietly accepting in trade. We have historically classified this district as a tolerated anomaly, too small to require formal attention. I don't believe that classification holds anymore. I'm not recommending intervention. I'm recommending this office finally decide, deliberately, what its actual position is, because right now we have no position, only inertia, and inertia is not a policy that survives contact with something growing this steadily. The meeting nobody wanted to call first. Her director reads the memo twice, the way people in that building have learned to read anything with Renata's name on it by now, and calls a meeting she clearly would rather not have to run. I want to understand what you're actually proposing, the director says. Are you telling me we should shut this thing down? No, Renata says. I'm telling you I don't think we could, even if we wanted to, without a fight that would look considerably worse for this government than the district itself does. I've read the coverage. Vesper Ashcombe, Tomas Reyes Broca. These aren't obscure cases anymore. ISTHMUS has credibility this state spent 5 years helping build, one court ruling at a time. If this office moves against a district that's become the place REDEEMR plus its own casualties go when nobody else will take them, we become the villain of a story we didn't even choose to be in. So what do you recommend? I recommend we stop pretending we haven't noticed, Renata says. I recommend this office open a formal, low-profile dialogue with the district's council. Not enforcement, not incorporation, just contact. Because right now the alternative is that this keeps growing entirely outside our view until it's large enough that noticing it becomes a crisis instead of a conversation. The first official visit. Renata makes the trip herself in a plain government vehicle, alone, deliberately without the retinue that would signal enforcement rather than curiosity, and finds Bartolome waiting for her at the district's edge. Not defensive, not performing hospitality either, just present, the way she's come to understand, from months of reading their council minutes, this community tends to greet almost everything. I want to be honest about why I'm here, she says, before he can ask. My office has finally noticed you. I'm not here to tell you what that means yet, because I genuinely don't know. I'm here because I'd rather understand what you've actually built before anyone above me decides what to do about it. And I don't trust anyone above me to bother with that step unless I do it first. That's more honesty than this district usually gets from your building, Bartolome says. Come to open council tonight. Watch it happen instead of reading about it in a summary. I think you'll understand faster that way. What she sees. She sits in the back of the pavilion that evening, notebook open but mostly unused, and watches a session unfold that has nothing dramatic in it at all. A dispute over water allocation between 2 cooperative farms, resolved after 40 minutes of genuine, unhurried argument by people who clearly expect to still be neighbors long after tonight's disagreement is settled. A proposal to expand the fabrication cooperative's servicing capacity, tabled for further study rather than rushed. A brief, almost incidental mention of a new open-door fund case under review, discussed with the same careful, unweighted attention as the water dispute, no more or less significant simply because the stakes for one displaced person happen to be considerably higher than an irrigation schedule. What strikes her most, writing it up afterward, isn't any single decision. It's the pace, a community solving its own problems in public, slowly, Without any of the theater or defensiveness, she spent a career watching from inside institutions built to move faster and explain less. Internal memorandum. Follow-up. I want to revise my earlier framing. I don't believe this district represents a governance failure this state has been slow to address. I believe it may represent a governance model our own institutions have simply never had occasion to develop, because we've never needed to, because we've always assumed a state or a corporation would eventually claim responsibility for anyone left over. This district exists specifically because that assumption stopped holding, and nobody upstream noticed the assumption had broken until this district quietly built something to stand in the gap. I don't have a recommendation ready yet. I have a genuine question I don't think this office has ever had to ask before. What does harmonization look like when the thing you're harmonizing with has already, on its own, solved a problem you didn't know you had? What Chuck hears about secondhand. Petra Villalobos mentions it to Cassandra, who mentions it to Sofía, who brings it, eventually, to the archive, where Chuck has spent enough decades reading exactly this shape of institutional first contact to recognize it before Sofía's even finished the sentence. A junior analyst, alone, in a plain car, asking honest questions instead of sending an inspection team. Chuck says, "That's rare. That's the kind of person this whole story has needed more of from the start, and mostly never gotten." "You think it's good news," Sofía says. "I think it's the first time in this entire saga that a government noticed something growing outside its control and chose curiosity before enforcement," Chuck says. "I don't know if that holds once it reaches whoever actually decides policy instead of just writing memos nobody above them reads yet. I know it's the best opening move I've watched anyone make toward that district since the day it opened its first door." She sets the report down and looks, for a long moment, at the shelves around her. Decades of boxes, each one labeled with the same 3 questions this whole institution has ever known how to ask honestly. What happened? Why it happened? What changed afterward? "I think," she says finally, "we might be watching the first chapter of an answer to the third one that doesn't have REDEEMR's name anywhere in it at all." Chapter 83. What they can't get anywhere else. Regional Logistics Cooperative, Playa del Carmen North. Service request log urgent. Escalated after 2 failed external contractor attempts. Cold chain refrigeration unit failure. Regional produce distribution warehouse, affecting 6 independent farm cooperatives export shipments. Original manufacturer discontinued this unit's control architecture 9 years ago. No authorized service contractor within 400-kilometer stocks compatible replacement components. Estimated spoilage loss if unresolved within 72 hours. Catastrophic to 3 of the 6 affected cooperatives' annual margin. The call that reaches Bartolome. He almost lets it go to the district's general inquiry line the way most outside requests do. But the warehouse manager on the other end sounds different from the usual tone ISTHMUS gets from regional business. Less curious, more desperate, the specific flatness of someone who has already exhausted every option that made sense to try first. "I was told your cooperative fabricates custom control components," she says. "I was told you did it fast. I have 6 farms about to lose a year's income over a part that doesn't exist anymore anywhere I can find it." "Send me the specs," Bartolome says. "I can't promise you anything. I can tell you who to ask. The person who can actually solve it." He brings it to the fabrication cooperative's workshop that afternoon, and it's Tomas, 4 months into his recovery, still finding his way back into a body of skills that seem to have survived his transfer more intact than his memory of acquiring them, who looks at the schematic longest before anyone else says anything. "I can build this," he says, quiet, surprising even himself a little. The way he's been surprised more than once these last months by what his hands still know before the rest of him catches up. "The control architecture's not that different from housekeeping firmware I spent a long time inside of before. I understand this kind of system from the wrong side of it. That's not nothing here." He works through the night with 2 of the cooperative's longer-tenured fabricators, and by morning has a working replacement component, hand-built, tested against the warehouse's own specifications relayed over a hastily arranged video call. Not elegant, not scalable, but functional, delivered by courier before the 72-hour window closes with 6 hours to spare. What the warehouse manager tells everyone she knows. Regional Logistics Cooperative internal memo, circulated to member farms. We want every member cooperative to be aware. This quarter's near-catastrophic cold chain failure was resolved, in full, within 72 hours, by a fabrication team at ISTHMUS Transition District, a group none of our official contractor lists even include. We are recommending this district be added to our approved emergency services roster effective immediately, and we understand at least 2 neighboring logistics cooperatives are considering the same. The story travels the way these things travel in a region small enough that everyone's business eventually touches everyone else's. Not through any deliberate campaign, just farm to farm, warehouse to warehouse, the specific, durable gratitude of people whose livelihood was actually saved rather than merely serviced. The number that reaches Renata's desk. Regional Administrative Office. Quarterly District Monitoring Summary. Addendum. This office has received, unprompted, 7 separate positive references to ISTHMUS Fabrication Cooperative from regional agricultural and logistics businesses over the past quarter, following a widely discussed emergency service resolution. We note this represents the first instance of the district generating positive economic sentiment among regional commercial actors independent of any government engagement, and the first tangible indication that the district's growth may carry benefits this office has not previously accounted for in its risk-focused monitoring framework. Renata reads the addendum she wrote herself, and sits with it a moment before adding one more line, the first genuinely recommendatory sentence she's put in any of these files in over a year. Recommend this office begin evaluating regional integration options, rather than continued passive monitoring alone, on the basis that the district's economic contribution now appears to exceed any documented cost or risk this office has identified to date. What it means to the ones inside it. Sabina finds Tomas at the workshop a few days later, still faintly astonished by his own week, and sits with him a while the way she's learned to sit with most of the district's newer arrivals. Not asking anything, just present, letting the conversation arrive on its own schedule. You saved 6 farms, she finally says. You know that, I hope, not just fixed a machine. Saved people's whole year. I don't know if I felt it the way you'd want me to have felt it. Tomas says, honest. The way he's learned honesty is the only currency this district actually asks of anyone. I felt the problem and the shape of the solution and some satisfaction when it worked. I don't know yet if that's the same thing as caring about the farms. I'm still learning which of my own reactions are real and which ones are just competence, running on its own the way it used to run for someone else. Maybe it doesn't matter which one it is yet, Sabina says. Maybe you get to find out slowly, the way the rest of us found out slowly what we actually believed, once nobody was asking us to prove it fast. He doesn't have an answer for that, and she doesn't ask for one, and the 2 of them sit a while longer in a workshop that has, this week, without any of them fully planning it, become the first thing about this district a government office has ever recommended getting closer to rather than further from. Chapter 84. The kind of recognition that costs something. Office of the Director General, Regional Economic Development, Memorandum to R. Cifuentes, Policy Analyst. Your addendum has reached my desk and I want to move on it. I've reviewed the district's economic footprint and I agree the passive monitoring posture no longer serves this state's interests. I'm prepared to recommend formal recognition, Special Economic Cooperation Zone status, which would regularize the district's tax position, extended access to state infrastructure investment, and open formal procurement relationships with the businesses already informally relying on it. I'd like you to lead the outreach. I'd also like you to understand, before you do, that SECZ designation carries governance requirements. A recognized zone requires a legally cognizable administrative authority, a board and incorporated entity, someone this state can hold a contract with and, when necessary, hold accountable to one. I don't think that's a formality we can waive. I think it's the actual price of the thing they've been asking for without knowing it. What Aurelio-chan offers. Renata brings Director General Chan's proposal to the pavilion herself, uncomfortable in a way she hasn't been since her first visit, because she has spent a year coming to respect this council enough to recognize, reading the term sheet on the drive over, exactly what it's actually asking them to give up. I want to be straightforward about the offer and straightforward about my own doubts at the same time, she tells the council, a fuller pavilion than she's ever addressed before watching her. Formal recognition, tax status, infrastructure investment, real, direct access to procurement contracts instead of word-of-mouth referrals from grateful farmers. It's a genuine offer, made in good faith, by someone who I believe actually respects what you've built here. She pauses. It also requires you to become something with a board, a single, legally accountable authority. I don't think Director General Chan is trying to take anything from you. I think he genuinely doesn't have a category in his own governing framework for an authority that isn't singular, and I don't think that absence is his fault any more than it was ever REDEEMR's fault that its own categories couldn't hold what it eventually created. The argument that takes 3 sessions. It isn't resolved the night she brings it, or the second night either. Emilio Ku, characteristically, names the fear plainest. We built this specifically so no single person could speak for all of us, he says. Bartolome chairs the sessions. He doesn't decide anything alone, and if he tried, this pavilion would remove him inside a week. That's not incidental to what we are. If we hand the state a board, a chair, a name it can hold a contract with, how long before that board starts making decisions faster than open council can argue with them, because a contract doesn't wait for consensus, and the businesses on the other end of it won't either. Sabina, who has spent 2 years now becoming the pavilion's conscience without ever asking for the role, offers something closer to a counterweight than an answer. I don't disagree with the fear, she says. I want to name something else alongside it, though. We turned away nobody who needed a door because we were poor enough to have to choose. We've been lucky. Luck isn't a governance model either. If formal status means the Open Door Fund never has to say no to someone like Tomas again because we finally have the resources to say yes properly, I don't think refusing that out of fear of what we might become is automatically the braver choice. Sometimes the brave choice is figuring out how to hold power carefully instead of refusing to hold any at all. The compromise Ixchel builds. It's Ixchel, again, who finds the shape neither side has quite articulated, drawing, the way she always does, on the district's own established habit of building structures that answer a real need without surrendering the thing that makes the need answerable honestly in the first place. What if the board exists, she proposes? But it isn't a board in the way the state means the word. What if it's a rotating administrative seat, 3 residents at a time, drawn by lot from the whole district, term limited to 1 year, with no authority to bind the council to anything the open pavilion hasn't already approved? The state gets a name to sign a contract with. We get a name that changes every year, belongs to no faction, and can't drift into becoming a permanent power center, because nobody sits in that seat long enough to build one. Will the state accept that? Bartolome asks. I don't know, Renata says honestly. From the back of the pavilion where she sat through all 3 sessions without once trying to steer them. I know it's the first proposal I've heard in a year of watching this place that actually sounds like it was built the way everything else here gets built. I'll take it back and find out. What Chan says when he reads it. He reads the counterproposal twice, the way careful officials tend to read anything that refuses to fit the template his own office drafted, and calls Renata into his office rather than simply approving or rejecting it by memo. This isn't what a special economic cooperation zone administrative authority is supposed to look like, he says. I want you to understand I could reject this on procedural grounds alone, and nobody above me would ever ask why. You could, Renata says. I'd ask you to consider what you'd actually be rejecting. Not a district refusing accountability. A district building a version of accountability that happens to be more resistant to capture than almost anything in our own governing statute currently allows for. I don't think that's a flaw in their proposal, Director General. I think it might be the most interesting piece of institutional design either of us has read all year, and I think saying no to it because it doesn't fit our template would be exactly the kind of category failure your own memo warned me to watch for. Chan is quiet for a long moment, turning the counterproposal over. I'll need to modify it, he finally says. Legal will require a permanent point of contact for liability purposes even if the substantive authority rotates. I'll need real teeth on financial reporting, not community trust alone. I can defend flexibility on governance to the legislature. I can't defend an audit trail I can't produce if someone eventually asks for one. That sounds like the kind of condition they'd actually understand, Renata says. They've spent 2 years arguing in public about exactly this kind of trade-off. I don't think honest requirements scare them. I think what scares them is losing the argument itself, the part where they get to keep having it out loud in that pavilion instead of behind a closed door somewhere neither of us is in the room for. Proposed Special Economic Cooperation Zone Framework. Revised Draft. Administrative Authority. Rotating 3-seat committee, drawn by lot, 1-year terms, non-renewable consecutively. Financial reporting. Mandatory, audited annually by an independent regional accountant. Published in full to both the state and the district's own open council. Substantive governance authority remains vested exclusively in ISTHMUS open council process. No rotating committee member may bind the district to any agreement not previously approved by open vote. This framework does not resolve every tension between state administrative requirements and this district's governance practice. It represents, instead, both parties' attempt to hold that tension honestly rather than paper over it. The state accepting a form of accountability it has not previously had reason to accommodate, the district accepting a degree of formal exposure it has not previously had reason to carry. Chapter 85 signed, with reservations. ISTHMUS Transition District, Open Council, Ratification Session Special Economic Cooperation Zone Framework, Final Vote. I want the record to show something before we vote, Sabina says, standing in a pavilion that has, over 2 years, grown a semi-permanent overflow of benches along its open edges to accommodate crowds none of the original builders anticipated. This isn't a victory. I don't want anyone here treating tonight like we won something. It's a trade. We are trading a piece of the thing that made us safe from becoming what we all left behind, for resources that will let us keep doing the work that actually matters. I think it's the right trade. I want it entered into the minutes that this council understood exactly what it was giving up, and chose it anyway with open eyes, rather than because anyone told us we had no choice. The vote passes for 101 to 89, the largest turnout in the district's history, the widest margin of dissent it has ever formally recorded, both facts sitting comfortably in the same result the way this pavilion has learned, across 2 years of exactly this kind of argument, to let comfort and disagreement coexist without either one canceling the other. The signing. The formal ceremony, when it comes, is smaller and less ceremonial than either government protocol or the district's own instincts would ordinarily produce. Director General Chan and the first rotating 3-seat committee, drawn by lot 2 weeks earlier and still visibly unaccustomed to the weight of their own titles, sign the framework at a folding table set up under the same open palapa roof where every real decision in this district's history has actually been made. I want to say something not in the prepared remarks, Chan tells the assembled crowd, setting the pen down. I've spent 20 years in regional governance believing accountability meant a single name on a contract. This district taught my office something I don't think we'd have learned any other way, that accountability can also mean a room full of people willing to argue about a decision in public until it's actually good, rather than simply defensible. I don't know how well this framework translates that back into a form the state can hold. I know we tried harder to get it right than my office has tried at almost anything else I've signed in my career. What arrives within the month? Regional Logistics Cooperative, Formal Service Contract. ISTHMUS Fabrication Cooperative is engaged as an approved emergency and specialty servicing contractor across the full regional logistics network, effective immediately upon SECZ ratification, at rates consistent with regional market standard. Quintana Roo Regional Infrastructure Fund. Grant Award. Approved. Expanded housing capacity, medical facility upgrade, and technical training center construction. ISTHMUS Transition District, funded per Special Economic Cooperation Zone Infrastructure Investment Provision. The district's population, already grown by a fifth over 2 years of informal expansion, begins climbing faster still. Not only the open door fund's careful, case-by-case arrivals now, but ordinary families drawn by housing, by work, by a place that has developed, almost without anyone deciding it should, a reputation for taking problems seriously that neither companies nor governments in the region seem able to match anymore. What Sofía notices. Reading the growth numbers. She brings the district's latest quarterly figures to Chuck in the archive, the two of them tracking a story that started 2 years ago, with a letter with no letterhead and a single woman nobody else could reach. It's not a rescue operation anymore, Sofía says. It's not even really a transition district in the sense the founding document describes. Housing construction, formal contracts, a training center. This is a town, Ileana. A real one, growing the way towns grow when something about them actually works. Chuck reads the figures slowly, the way she reads everything now, decades of this office having taught her to distrust the first read of any number that looks like unambiguous good news. I keep thinking about Sabina's line from the ratification vote, she says. This isn't a victory. I think she was right to say it, and I think she'd be the first person in that pavilion to tell you the growth we're looking at right now is exactly the moment a place like this either holds on to what made it worth saving people, or starts quietly becoming something else while everyone's too busy celebrating the growth to notice the shape changing underneath it. You think it's already happening? I think it's the question every institution in this entire saga eventually has to answer, whether it wants to or not, Chuck says. REDEEMR asked it and failed for 40 years before anything meaningful changed. I don't know yet whether this district asks it any better. I know they've built more honest machinery for asking it than anything REDEEMR ever had. A pavilion instead of a boardroom, an open vote instead of a trust protector clause. That's not nothing. I've learned the hard way that it's also not a guarantee. The last line in the district's own record this year. Ground truth, field manual, amended note, added by council vote. We are larger now than the founders who wrote this manual ever expected to become. We want that recorded plainly alongside everything else in this document because we have learned, watching a company larger and older than our whole district collapse under the weight of what it stopped being honest with itself about, that the moment an institution stops writing down its own uncomfortable truths is the moment it starts becoming one. We do not know what we will be in another 10 years. We know only that the pavilion stays open, the vote stays real, and anyone always gets to stand up and ask the hard question, including the question of whether we are still underneath everything we've built since the place we meant to be when we started. Chapter 86. The Deal That Couldn't Wait. Sierra Franca Minerals, S.A., Servicing and Housing Partnership Proposal Confidential. Time-limited offer. Sierra Franca Minerals proposes a 3-year exclusive servicing contract with Aldea Zama Fabrication Cooperative for all specialty equipment maintenance at our regional lithium extraction site, valued at an amount exceeding the district's entire current annual budget. As a condition of this partnership, Sierra Franca additionally requests the district assume housing and welfare administration for our contracted mining workforce. Approximately 340 laborers, currently housed in company-managed dormitory facilities at the extraction site itself, which our board has determined would benefit from independent civic oversight. This offer is extended on an exclusivity basis and expires in 14 days. Sierra Franca requires the receiving party's discretion regarding terms during the negotiation period, standard for agreements of this scale and sensitivity. The committee. Noemi Balch has held her seat on the rotating administrative committee for 4 months, drawn by lot the way everyone is, still finding her footing in a role she never sought and half expected to spend mostly signing routine paperwork nobody else wanted to read closely. She reads the Sierra Franca proposal twice at her kitchen table before she brings it to the other 2 seated members, and feels, reading it, the specific vertigo of holding something considerably larger than anything the committee has handled before. This is more money than the state infrastructure grant, says Rogelio Itza, the committee's second seat, a former dock worker who has spent 4 months becoming, in Noemi's private estimation, considerably better at this job than any of them expected to be. 14 days. If we take this to open council, that's at minimum 2 sessions, probably 3 the way we run things. We could lose it. Then maybe we should lose it, says the third seat, a young agronomist named Perla Coy, who has said very little in 4 months and says this quietly, without heat. Read the second paragraph again. They want us running housing for 340 people we've never met, on terms we're not allowed to discuss openly. Since when does this district agree to anything it can't argue about in public first? Since we might not survive turning down money like this if it keeps not coming, Rogelio says. I've watched people leave this district for work 3 towns over because we couldn't match a wage. I don't want to be the one who tells them we had a way to fix that and decided our process mattered more than they did. What Noemi does instead of deciding. She doesn't sign anything. She also doesn't, for 2 days, bring it to the pavilion, sitting instead with the confidentiality clause, turning over the specific vertigo of being asked, for the first time in this district's history, to keep something significant from the very process that was built to prevent exactly this kind of decision from ever being made by 3 people alone. It's Ixchel who finally forces the question, not through any special authority but through the same habit that's carried her through every hard case this district has faced. She hears about the proposal secondhand, from a fabrication cooperative worker excited about the possibility of new equipment funding, and goes straight to Noemi's door rather than waiting for the committee to bring it forward on its own schedule. "You've had this 4 days," Ixchel says, not accusing, just naming it. "The confidentiality clause runs out the moment you bring it to open council. I understand why that's tempting to avoid. I need you to understand what it means if this committee starts deciding, even once, that some deals are too valuable to argue about in the room where we argue about everything else. We might lose it," Noemi says. "You might," Ixchel says. "I'd rather lose a contract than lose the thing that makes this district worth a contract in the first place. I don't think that's naive. I think it's the only reason Sierra Franca wanted us instead of some other cooperative closer to their site. We're worth more to them precisely because we're the kind of place that doesn't cut corners. If we cut this one quietly to get the deal, I don't know what we'd actually be selling them anymore." The emergency session. They convene the pavilion on 2 days' notice, the fastest session in the district's history, word spreading fast enough that the crowd that gathers rivals even the SZ ratification vote, an urgency in the air that Sabina, watching people find seats, recognizes as something the district hasn't had to hold since its earliest, most uncertain years. "I want to read the second paragraph aloud," Noemi says, opening the session, "because I think most of you haven't seen it, and I think you need to before anyone argues anything else." She reads it. The pavilion goes very quiet. 340 people, Emilio Cu says, standing almost before she's finished. "Housed by a mining company, transferred to our administration under a confidentiality clause, on a 14-day clock. I don't need anyone to explain to me what that shape looks like. I've read the same shape in every REDEEMR document ISTHMUS has ever published. A company that doesn't want its own labor practices examined too closely, looking for a partner willing to put a friendlier name on the door. We don't know that," Rogelio says. "We don't know anything about how those workers are actually treated. Maybe this is a genuine attempt to improve conditions. Maybe we're the first honest oversight those people have ever had. Then let's find out honestly," Bartolome says. "Instead of signing first and hoping, I'd propose this pavilion send a delegation to that extraction site this week before any contract terms are finalized, not negotiators, observers. Let people who actually live under whatever we'd be agreeing to manage tell us themselves whether this is oversight or laundering. What the delegation finds." Sabina goes herself, along with 2 others, and what they find at the extraction site isn't the clean, ambiguous uncertainty Rogelio hoped for. Its dormitories built for 200, currently holding closer to 400, water quality complaints logged and ignored for months, a turnover rate high enough that half the workforce currently on site has been there under 6 weeks, and a foreman who grows visibly uneasy the moment Sabina starts asking, plainly, how long the confidentiality clause has been standard practice for Sierra Franca's contractors. Delegation report to open council. "We did not find evidence of anything approaching what REDEEMR Plus once did to the people in its custody. We want to be precise about that, because precision matters and exaggeration would insult everything this district has learned about the difference between negligence and atrocity. What we found was a company that has let conditions degrade because no outside party has ever been positioned to notice, and that appears to be seeking this district's reputation specifically to make that invisibility permanent rather than to fix what it's created. We do not recommend accepting this contract as offered. We recommend Aldea Zama make a counteroffer instead. Full transparency, no confidentiality clause, and independent authority to actually improve conditions rather than simply administer them is found, at a price this cooperative is worth, whether or not Sierra Franca is willing to pay it. The counter, and what it costs. Aldea Zama Transition District. Counterproposal. We decline the confidentiality provision entirely. Any partnership regarding workforce welfare will be conducted under this district's ordinary governance transparency, including public reporting to our own open council. We are prepared to offer our fabrication cooperative's servicing expertise on the terms proposed. We are not prepared to accept housing administration as a private, undisclosed arrangement, at any price. Sierra Franca withdraws the offer within 3 days, taking the servicing contract to a competitor cooperative 2 states over. A real loss, the pavilion learns at its next session, quantified plainly and without euphemism by Noemi, whose 4 months on the committee have taught her, if nothing else, that the district's own honesty has to apply to costs as much as to principles. We lost the money, she tells the pavilion. I want that said plainly, the way Sabina taught this room to say things plainly from the very first session I ever watched. We are not richer tonight than we were 2 weeks ago. I think we're something else instead, and I don't have a clean word for what that's worth yet, except that I'd rather be the district that turned this down than the one that quietly became what it turned down in order to afford not turning it down. Nobody applauds. Nobody needs to. The pavilion simply sits with it the way it has learned across 2 years to sit with almost everything that matters. A real cost, honestly named, held in public, by a room that chose it with open eyes rather than have it happen to them the way it happened to everyone this whole long story has already lost count of trying to help. Let me check what's already established about the Cenote civilization before I bring it into contact with Aldea Zama. Since the directive is explicit about not contradicting or flattening existing canon. Chapter 87. What the Foundation crew found. Aldea Zam Transition District. Infrastructure Project Log Medical Facility Expansion. Site B. Foundation Survey. Standard geotechnical survey ahead of foundation excavation identified an anomaly at approximately 11 meters depth. A void consistent with karst cave structure, not indicated on any regional hydrological survey this district has access to, including the Gran Aquifero Maya mapping project's published data for this sector. Void extends beyond the range of our current survey equipment. Construction on Site B is paused pending further assessment. The morning Tomas finds it. He's not supposed to be the one running the survey equipment. The district contracted a geotechnical firm out of the regional capital for that. But the firm's technician is running 2 hours late, and Tomas, who has spent the better part of a year discovering exactly which of his retained instincts are actually useful in a body that no longer needs to read water for a living, offers to walk the ground-penetrating radar line himself while they wait. He almost doesn't flag it. The readout shows what could be an ordinary limestone cavity, the kind this whole coastline is riddled with, nothing that should stop a foundation pour on its own. What stops him is something underneath the geology, a return signature the equipment's own reference library doesn't have a clean match for, not rock, not water, not air in any configuration the manual illustrates. That's not supposed to look like that, the technician says, arriving late, leaning over Tomas's shoulder at the screen. I've run 100 of these along this coast. I've never seen a return shaped quite like that one. The decision not to keep digging. Bartolome calls a halt on Site B the same afternoon, over the visible frustration of the construction crew, who point out, reasonably, that the medical facility is already behind schedule and that a strange radar return 11 meters down isn't obviously anyone's emergency. I know it's not convenient, Bartolome tells them. I'd rather lose a month than pour concrete over something we don't understand yet. In a district that's spent 2 years building its whole reputation on not cutting corners when something's unclear, we'll bring it to open council. Let the people who'll be living on top of whatever's down there decide how carefully we want to go. The pavilion, again. It's a small item on a crowded agenda, wedged between a water allocation dispute and a routine budget report and Noemi. Reading the survey findings aloud to a pavilion that has learned, by now, to take even small items seriously, watches the room's attention sharpen the moment she reaches the part about the unmatched signature. I want to be clear about what we actually know, she says. It's probably nothing. Karst geology under this whole coast is unpredictable, and equipment misreads happen. I also want to be clear about what we don't know, which is more than usual for this kind of finding. I'd propose a careful, limited exploratory survey before we resume construction, not excavation, not disturbance, just enough information that we're building on top of something we actually understand. Emilio Ku, who has spent 2 years being the pavilion's most reliable source of practical skepticism, raises the question nobody else has quite gotten to yet. Has anyone checked whether this shows up on any historical record at all? Not the state's survey. Older than that. This coast has cave systems people have known about for longer than any governments had a mapping project. Sabina, quiet until now, answers before anyone else can. My grandmother used to say there were passages under this whole stretch of coast that went further than anyone had reason to walk. I always thought it was the kind of thing grandmothers say. I'd like the survey to actually check, before we assume she was only telling stories. The first careful look. The exploratory team, 2 cavers contracted from a regional speleological cooperative, Tomas along in an advisory capacity given his role in the original find, and a representative from the district's medical facility planning committee to ensure nothing decided down there loses sight of what's still needed up above, descends 11 days later, equipment calibrated conservatively, a strict protocol limiting how far anyone goes on the first pass. What they find, at the edge of their survey line, isn't collapse or dead-end rock. It's a passage, narrow but navigable, running further into the dark than their lights or their nerve carry them that day, air moving through it in a slow, steady current their instruments register but can't yet explain. The specific, patient signature of a space connected to something considerably larger than 11 meters of foundation survey was ever built to find. Exploratory survey. Preliminary report. Passage confirmed navigable beyond current survey limit. Airflow detected, consistent with connection to a larger, currently unmapped system. No structural risk identified to planned surface construction if foundation is adjusted 12 meters north of original site plan. We recommend the district treat this finding as significant beyond its engineering implications and consider, separately from the construction question, whether further exploration is something this community wants to pursue and on what terms. What the pavilion decides, for now. They don't decide much that session, adjust the foundation plan, resume construction on Site B, and table the larger question of the passage itself for a future session nobody rushes to schedule, the district's own established patience holding even here, especially here. Sabina lingers after the session ends, standing at the edge of the pavilion with Ixchel, looking out toward Site B in the fading light. You don't seem surprised, Ixchel says. I'm not entirely, Sabina says. I've lived on this coast my whole life. I've always had the feeling there was more underneath it than anyone building on top ever bothered to ask about. I don't know what we've found. I know I'd rather this district be the kind of place that asks carefully, over years if it has to, than the kind that either paves over it without looking or goes charging in without thinking about what it might owe whatever's actually down there. Tomas, walking past with the last of the survey equipment, catches the end of it and stops, something in his own retained instincts stirring at the thought in a way he doesn't fully understand yet. I keep thinking about the airflow, he says. Something that big, breathing that steadily. This whole time, underneath everything we've been building up here without ever knowing it was there. He looks toward Site B, dark now, the construction lights switched off for the night. I don't know why that feels important. I just know it does. Chapter 88. The Second Mediator. Great Lakes Corridor Monitoring Unit. 18-month Stability Review Regional Humanitarian Coordination Office. The ceasefire framework established in Sector 9, sustained continuously for 18 months, has now survived 2 seasonal displacement crises, 1 contested local election, and a resource dispute that historically would have collapsed prior agreements within weeks. This office attributes the framework's unusual durability to a deliberate training investment made 14 months ago. 3 local mediators, selected jointly by both factions' community councils, trained in structured negotiation methodology by the figure local populations refer to as the nuncio, working alongside, rather than in place of existing traditional authority structures. The nuncio's direct involvement in day-to-day mediation has declined steadily over the past 6 months as the local mediator's own credibility has grown. This office notes this as a genuine success of capacity transfer, uncommon in conflict zones of this duration and complexity. The message that arrives differently. Marisol has learned, across 2 years, to recognize the particular texture of hope that costs her something versus the kind that's simply wishful, and the message that reaches her one ordinary Tuesday afternoon carries none of the careful hedging every prior communication from Sector 9 has carried. It doesn't come through Adela No or ISTHMUS, or any of the institutional channels that have carried news of her sister for years now. It comes directly, routed through the same humanitarian coordination office that first connected them, a single line, unmistakably composed by Vesper herself rather than relayed through anyone else's careful summary. Direct message, Sector 9 to Marisol Ashcombe. The framework holds without me now, most days. I have spent 6 months finding out I have less to weigh against nothing than I used to. I don't know what that means yet. I wanted you to be the first to know. I'm asking myself the question again. What she does with it. She doesn't call anyone right away. She sits with the message for a long time, the way she's learned to sit with almost everything connected to her sister since the day she first stood in a village with no name and watched Vesper turn a stimulus test into a father's whole unbearable hope, and finds, reading it a fourth time, that she's crying in a way that has nothing to do with grief. She calls ISTHMUS before Poot, before ISTHMUS, before anyone official, a habit she's built over 2 years of letting the people who actually stood in the pavilion and argued for a door be the first to know when someone might finally walk through it. She's asking the question again, Marisol says, and doesn't need to explain which question, because ISTHMUS has carried this file long enough to know exactly what those words mean. Does she know what's changed here? ISTHMUS says. The medical facility, the training center. We're not the district that made the first offer anymore. I don't want her deciding based on what we were 2 years ago, if she's finally ready to decide at all. I don't think either of us knows what she knows, Marisol says. I think that's the next thing I have to find out. The visit that's different from the first 2. Marisol makes the journey a 3rd time, and this one feels different from the start. Not urgent, not desperate, the particular unhurried quality of a trip made because something might finally be ready rather than because something might otherwise be lost. She finds Vesper in the same village, though the room they meet in this time isn't a negotiation session at all. A quiet afternoon, 2 local mediators handling a minor dispute 2 streets over without any need for Vesper's presence. A fact Marisol notices Vesper herself seems to be noticing, turning it over with something that looks, for the first time, less like calculation and more like genuine uncertainty about what to do with the space it's opened up. Tell me what's changed, Vesper says, before Marisol can say anything at all. The district's bigger, Marisol says. Formal now. A real medical facility under construction. I don't know what it'll be able to do for someone like you. I want to be honest about that. Nobody's promised me anything specific. I know it's more than existed when ISTHMUS first found you. I know there's a woman named Tomas who fixes things nobody else can fix anymore. Living there, for years into figuring out which parts of himself survived. I know there's a pavilion that's argued honestly about 7 different people so far, and lost money once on principle, and I think it's become the kind of place that might actually be able to hold whatever you turn out to need instead of just offering you a door and hoping. Vesper is quiet for a long time, looking out at a street where 2 mediators she trained are settling a dispute without her, doing competently and calmly the exact work that used to require the whole of her, every hour, with no room left over for anything else. I don't know if I still know how to be somewhere without a mission attached to every hour of it, she finally says. I want to tell you that honestly, before either of us gets ahead of what this actually is. I'm not saying yes today. I'm not asking you to, Marisol says. The door's been standing open 2 years. I think it can stand open a while longer. What she does say yes to. I'd like to visit, Vesper says finally, and the word lands in the room with a weight that surprises both of them. Not stay. Not yet. I want to see the place that's been holding a door for me before I decide whether I know how to walk through one at all. I think I need that to be true first before anything else. ISTHMUS Research Collaborative. Field Note. Subject Vesper Ashcombe has requested a supervised, time-limited visit to Aldea Zama Transition District, her first voluntary movement away from active field deployment in over 4 years. This is not a recovery. This is not a return. It is, by every measure this organization has learned to value over years of exactly this kind of case, the first genuinely new thing to happen to her in longer than any of us have been tracking. We are treating this with the same patience the district itself modeled for us from the very first pavilion session. No promises, no countdown, just a door and a woman walking toward it slowly enough to still change her mind at any point along the way, which is, after everything this whole saga has ever taught anyone about consent, precisely the only kind of walking toward it that means anything at all.